On December 12, 2018, Laura Luelmo was going about her daily business as she does every day, as suddenly after 4:20 p.m. she stopped making contact. The police immediately launched an investigation, during which they discovered a number of eerie facts that allowed them to solve the mystery of the young teacher's disappearance. Laura Luelmo was born in the early 90s in the city of Zamora in northwestern Spain. She was the daughter of Maria Teresa Hernandez, a civil servant, and Jose Angel Luelmo, an agricultural engineer. She had two siblings named Violeta and Angel. After high school, Laura studied fine arts at Salman University and worked at the National Library. She then traveled to Mexico and enrolled at the Autonomous University of Puebla, where she studied humanities. Laura's classmates described her as a very cheerful, funny and intelligent girl who easily found a common language with everyone. After returning to her native Zamora, the girl dedicated herself to her vocation of teaching children. In the second half of 2018, she joined the staff of Nostra Senora del Rocio School, located in the northwest of the city, as a substitute teacher. Very dedicated, she won the love of all her students. At the end of the school year, she had the opportunity to take up another substitute position at the Vázquez Diaz Institute in the city of Nerva. It was for this reason that, at the beginning of December 2018, she moved to a hotel near the institute until a colleague rented for her a small house in El Campillo, almost 9 kilometers from the city of Nerva. On Monday, December 9, 2018, when Laura moved into the modest building on Via Cordoba in El Campillo, she never imagined that it would be the last place she would live. As she was getting settled into the house, she noticed something that made her feel uncomfortable. Her neighbor across the hall, a man a few years older, named Bernardo, caught her eye. She noticed that every time she left the house for work or shopping, he would stand at the door or window and stare at her intently. On December 12th, Laura went to work at the institute as usual. Bernardo was there again, watching her. She spent the day as usual, and when classes were over, she got into her blue car and drove home to El Campiglio. Bernardo was outside the house again watching her. She texted her boyfriend, Teofilo Jimenez, to tell him about the situation, but he didn't have time for any help. Laura told Teofilo that she would go for a walk to be away from her neighbor for as long as possible. A few minutes passed, and at 4:20 p.m. she texted the boyfriend again, letting him know that she didn't know if she was going for a walk or not because it was too windy. But it is known that Laura did leave the house to go for a little walk. Then she went to the supermarket, where she bought some things. After that, the girl did not communicate with any of her loved ones. Laura's absence was quickly noticed when she did not show up for work. A colleague who rented a house for her called her phone but received no answer. Concerned by this strange silence, the teacher reported Laura's disappearance to the civil guard. At the same time, the girl's father did the same and, unable to contact her, filed a report about her disappearance with the National Police Station in Samori. At the insistence of Laura's colleague, the civil guard sent a patrol to Cordoba Street, taking the key from the landlady. They entered the house but did not notice anything strange. Nevertheless, they searched the premises but came out empty-handed. At the moment when the police officers were searching the house that Laura was renting, Bernardo Montoya, the girl's neighbor, came out of his house. The officers approached him to ask if he had seen his neighbor in the previous hours, and he replied that he did not even know who she was, that he did not know who lived in the house, and that he hardly ever went out and had little contact with his neighbors. At first, the police had no reason to doubt Bernard's word. The man, who was carrying a basket and a blanket at the time, was free to leave, but the officers were left with a slight doubt, as they thought he was somewhat nervous. When they returned to the station, they decided to check his background and found that Bernardo Montoya had an extensive criminal record and had only recently been released from prison. As investigators found out, the man had a hard time adjusting to society. He and his twin Luciana were born on October 13, 1968 in Catalonia, but they later moved with their parents to Cardigan. As a child, Bernardo was very close to his twin brother, and together they fought with peers, cheated and pulled off hurtful pranks. Once, while in 4th grade, the brothers set fire to a school classroom. These problematic tendencies did not disappear in adulthood. On the contrary, they took on more serious forms. For example, his wife and mother of his 2 children separated from him as a result of his abuse. It is also known that Bernardo had been addicted to drugs since the age of 22 and was involved in various property crimes. By the age of 30, he had already been involved in violent acts of a more serious nature. The first of these occurred in late 1995. Bernardo Montoya was scheduled to stand trial for a home invasion and assault and battery case he had committed a few months earlier. In mid-December, an 82-year-old woman named Cecilia was scheduled to testify as a witness. Fearing that she would accuse him, on December 13th of that year Bernardo Montoya entered the woman's bedroom, where he hid and waited for her when it became dark. The accused came out from behind the door, lunged at Cecilia and caught her off guard, stabbing her 6 times in the neck, from which she died. However, this did not bring him freedom, rather the opposite. The civil guard continued to pursue him and caught up with him around Christmas. 2 years later, on November 5, 1997, he was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice, in addition to the charges already against him, and sentenced to 17 years and 7 months in prison. Although Bernard's behavior on the streets was violent, in prison he behaved like a model prisoner. It was for this reason that he was granted a few days vacation in 2008. However, instead of taking advantage of this time and spending it with his family, he returned to criminal activity. Bernardo threatened a 27-year-old girl walking her dog with a knife and then stabbed her, but luckily she survived. The police caught him and gave him an extra year in jail for the offense. But that didn't stop him from getting another vacation the following year, 2009. This time he didn't use it to commit a crime, but to escape. Bernardo Montoya did not return to prison after that, and 10 months passed during which no one knew where he was. In fact, the police never found him. Bernardo himself volunteered to come to the prison to be put back in, and for this he was also given a year and a few months added to his sentence. With all that said, Bernardo Montoya's sentence ended in 2015, but his freedom didn't last long. 9 months later, he was back in prison, and this time for 2 violent robberies. He served his sentence from 2016 to 2018, and it was in November 2018 that the man went to live in El Campillo after serving his sentence. Thanks to all this information, Bernardo Montoya became a suspect in Laura's disappearance. The authorities didn't know what they were dealing with: kidnapping, murder, imprisonment. They didn't understand what was going on. Would Laura's kidnapper demand a ransom or not? In the end, everything remained in doubt. Since Bernardo Montoya was the only possible suspect, they couldn't let him out of their sight. The officers organized a small operation in front of Laura's house. It was supposedly done to keep an eye on the missing girl's house, but in fact it was done to keep an eye on Bernardo Montoya. They didn't want the neighbors to talk about it, and they didn't want him to find out about it. However, Bernardo already had suspicions, and one night after Laura disappeared on December 13th, he ran out of the house and didn't return. A neighbor saw him leave and reported him to the police, but they were unable to catch him. The day after the escape, Bernardo visited the hospital. He also visited a woman in prison with whom he had a romantic relationship. The police again entered the girl's house to search it, but this time with her father and boyfriend. They knew her belongings well and could tell if anything was missing. Indeed, sneakers and pants were missing from the house, as well as her phones and keys. These items confirmed the hypothesis that Laura had had an accident while walking. Therefore, the search was intensified in the afternoon of the same day. On the morning of December 15th, investigators accessed the geolocation from Laura's phone. Thanks to this data, they were able to establish that she was near her home on the afternoon of December 12th, and that the last signal from her phone was received by an antenna in the El Campillo area at 9 p.m. Early the next morning, specialists and volunteers organized a search in a 5 kilometers radius around the village. This involved the use of helicopters, dogs, and even police officers to inspect wells in the area. In the afternoon, authorities found Bernardo Montoya's car, a black Alfa Romeo, at his father's house. Using surveillance cameras, officers followed the suspect, who drove his vehicle to the home of other relatives in another community. On December 16th, a second search operation was conducted, this time 10 kilometers around El Campillo, with more police, volunteers, and far more resources. On that day, the search team unknowingly walked near Laura's body but did not find it. The next day, a new check was made in the same radius. At 12:30 a.m., a volunteer found clothes in a field and reported them. About 200 meters away from these clothes lay the semi-naked body of Laura Luelmo, which showed various marks of violence. Only thanks to a tattoo on her torso was it possible to quickly identify her. Specialists were summoned by helicopter from Madrid and conducted a preliminary examination of the body and the scene. The investigators were certain that Laura could not have reached the site on foot on her own. The body was recovered at 6:30 a.m. and taken to the Forensic Anatomical Institute in Huelva. The discovery of Laura's body at this location was somewhat disconcerting, as the last signal from her phone was received many kilometers away in the opposite direction. The agents continued to investigate the only suspect. In the early morning hours of December 18th, they entered Bernardo Montoya's home, for which they had to break a window. After several hours of searching, investigators became convinced that it was a crime scene, particularly because of several bloodstains found in the room. Meanwhile, around noon, another group of police officers closely followed Bernardo Montoya's car. He drove through the town of Huelva and then took the route leading back to El Campillo. When he reached a road leading into a wooded area, he realized that he was being followed. He then decided to get out of the car and began to run away, turning off the road into the countryside. After a short police chase, Bernardo Montoya was apprehended by the authorities and taken to the station for detailed questioning. After several hours of pressure to tell what he knew about Laura's murder, the man finally confessed. He confirmed that he had indeed been with her the day she disappeared, but denied having killed or raped her. Bernardo said that on December 12th, he was in the village and saw Laura. She approached him and asked him where the supermarket was. He showed her a path, but it was actually a trap. This path led her to a dead end. When the girl found herself in this place, Bernardo took the opportunity and attacked her. He hit her on the head and rendered her unconscious, then tied her hands behind her back and put her in the trunk of his car, covering her with a blanket. Bernardo then drove to a deserted place and there pulled Laura, still unconscious, out of the trunk of the car. He carried her to a field and decided to undress her. The man allegedly wanted to rape her but said he could not because he suffers from erectile dysfunction. Bernardo said he left Laura there, half naked but unconscious, and that she was still alive when he left. This confession was not at all credible to the investigators, given all the evidence they had. First, the bloodstains found in the living room of Bernard's house. By then, they had already been analyzed and it was proven that the DNA belonged to Laura. In addition, various genetic traces were found throughout Bernard's house, belonging to both him and the girl. Moreover, forensic examination of the victim's body established that she had indeed been raped and Bernard's DNA was found on her body. As additional information, it should be noted that according to the first forensic examination conducted, Laura's death occurred 2–3 days after her disappearance. This was also inconsistent with Bernard's testimony. Added to this were the phone signals from his phone and Laura's phone. They also denied that the events took place in the area. Everything pointed to the fact that it happened in the vicinity of the houses. Further evidence of Laura's presence in her neighbor's house were some items bought for her at the supermarket before the attack. For investigators, Bernard's lie was nothing more than a way to avoid a violent charge as well as a murder charge that could have resulted in a life sentence. A lieutenant colonel in the Central Operations Division of the Guardia Civil named Jesus said that Bernardo Montoya was very impulsive and that he was a disorganized killer who thought that investigators would not be able to implicate him in what happened. The case continued to be investigated and caused some controversy. In January 2019, a second forensic examination of Laura's body was conducted, in which it was recorded that the first examination failed to correctly determine the day and time of death. A new conclusion showed that the girl died almost immediately and did not live even 8 hours after her disappearance. After these events, another one happened, which incredibly shook the case. Bernardo Montoya radically changed his version of events. Now he said that he was only transporting Laura's body, and the real culprit was a woman named Josefa, a former friend of Bernard's whom he met in prison. The man's lawyer told authorities that his client lied out of love. At the time, his ex-partner asked him for help and he loved her, was out of his mind and under the influence of illegal substances, so he agreed to whatever she asked. It is alleged that to lend credibility to the story, Bernardo Montoya gave the location of the murder weapon at this location, which was very close to where Laura's body was found. According to the man, there was a hammer, which was supposedly used by his former partner to take the life of the young teacher. However, the police conducted a search and found nothing. They also called Josefa to testify, but she did not show up and they immediately requested an arrest warrant. But as time went on, this line of investigation was dropped because Josefa showed up. She had an ironclad alibi, and besides, there was nothing to link her directly to Laura's murder. At any rate, this version of Bernardo Montoya's story offered no explanation as to why rape marks were found on Laura's body, and why his DNA was found on it. When the date of the trial became clear, the relatives of the victim and Bernard's defense agreed that everything would take place behind closed doors, without the presence of the media. During the trial, the defense continued to argue that Josefa was the perpetrator. In addition, to refute the rape charge, they presented the results of a medical examination, according to which the defendant was impotent. According to the defense, this condition did not allow him to be considered guilty of rape. The prosecution then provided their chronology of events, and according to them, the following occurred on that fateful day. That day, like the day before, Laura ran into her neighbor Bernard. But this time it was different. The man took advantage of the seclusion of the place and the darkness of the night. He used a metal object to frighten Laura and forced her to enter his house. Once there, the girl tried to defend herself and hit him hard in the jaw. It was because of this blow that Bernardo ended up in the hospital a few days later. Fearing that Laura would escape, the man tied her hands behind her back. He then took off her clothes and raped her, completing this perverted act. The man gave her several severe blows to the head, from which the young teacher died. This is why authorities discovered bloodstains in Bernard's home. Soon after, the man took his car, opened the trunk and put Laura's body in there. He then covered her with a blanket, got behind the wheel and drove to the place where the girl's body was later found. He took her out of the trunk and left her there. After that, he took her clothes, which he had also brought with him, and left them a few meters away from the body. This was done to confuse the authorities. Bernardo wanted people to think that the murder and rape happened there, so that the officers would not even think of searching his house. Afterward, he took Laura's other belongings, which he had also brought by car, and threw them in a trash can. When Bernardo returned to the house, he cleaned up as best he could, removing the most noticeable stains. A few hours later, he picked up Laura's cell phone and returned to the car. He drove to a place completely opposite to where he had left the girl's body and dumped the phone there. It was he who turned it off at 9 o'clock at night. In doing so, he thought that the authorities would not take him under suspicion, but apparently he was sorely mistaken. On November 19, 2021, a jury unanimously found Bernardo Montoya guilty on charges of murder, rape, and unlawful imprisonment. On December 10th of the same year, the Provincial Court of Huelva sentenced Bernardo Montoya to the capital punishment of life imprisonment, plus an additional 17.5 years for unlawful imprisonment combined with a sexual offense. He was also ordered to pay 400,000 euros in compensation to the victim's parents and sisters. Friends, what do you think about this story? Write your opinion in the comments and subscribe to my YouTube channel.